Does that make sense? Stop me if I get you. You know, if you got any question about anything. Anything so far? Okay. So we talked about getting ripples. So if you get little ripples in the wood when you're doing a planing cut, what causes that? Coming off the bevel and going too fast. Okay, I've already got a tenon on here, and I think you've seen people talk about tenons before. You want to make sure you got one cut appropriate for your chuck, in this case parallel jaws, and you want to make it very clean on the inside. No debris. This is one of my favorite woods, Bradford Pear. I always keep a lot of it around. It seems like when I get it, I get a lot of it, more than I can make bowls out of, so I turn a lot of it into spindle stock, put it on the shelf. And I do a lot of spindle work. One of the other things I want to talk about, tool rest is real important. Taking care of your tool rest and dressing it. Some of y'all might have seen me at the very beginning, painstakingly taking a drill and getting rid of all the dings that you're going to get in this cast iron. And inevitably, if you got a cast iron tool rest, there's going to be some little dings in there from catches or a sharp edge of a tool. And you've got to dress those up with a mill file periodically, and then follow it up with a little bit of sandpaper up to about 240 grit. And then it's not a bad idea. I always keep a paraffin candle. Rub a little paraffin candle, that'll help fill up some of the little small nicks. And the reason you want to do that is you can see when we're doing that peeling cut is you're coming along riding that bevel, you're riding along on this tool rest, so you're riding along on the thing, and it'll transmit any little nick along the tool into the wood, and then you're going to wind up with less than a perfect surface. Now might be a good time to talk about some of the differences between the different types of skews. There's several different kinds. You've got big ones, little ones. You know, this is a big one. My favorite is this one by Jet. It's got a little short handle. I wasn't sure whether I was going to like it, but it turns out for a small skew this size, the handle's very comfortable and it works real well. And it's a real high quality tool. And I want to show you some of the differences between cheap skews and good skews and a variety. Now, there's probably basically three different types of skews. You've got an oval skew, which I've never used before. The profile of that's Nick Cook's favorite. Sorby sells one, and it's got a profile that looks something like that. Now, supposedly the advantage of it is you've got a nice rounded area. It makes it great for planing cuts because you've got that round surface rolling along the tool rest. The downside, some of the downsides of it, is it's milled out of a piece of steel like this, and you've lost all this extra mass. So it tends to be a little less mass, and a little more flimsy. It's also, because of this rotating edge, this rounded edge here, it's a little more difficult to sharpen holding it on a tool rest. And we're going to show you that in a little while. And yet, for the people that like them, they swear by them. Other people say it was a marketing gimmick. They didn't have them for the first couple of hundred years when people were using skews, and it's only been in recent history they started using it. Richard Raffin likes it for planing cuts, nothing else. Keith Rowley, that's written one of the best books for new turners called A Foundation Course in Woodturning, he likes it for planing cuts. I've never used it. There's no right or wrong to a lot of tools. It's whatever you like. And the other consideration is who's teaching you. If you got somebody teaching you how to use a skew and they use an oval skew, then maybe you ought to get an oval skew. But if you got somebody like Nick Cook teaching you, then it's a good thing to learn how to use oval skew. But for the rest of us, not so much so. Now, this particular skew is made out of a round bar. Question?
No, I was just going to say, I actually found another use for a skew. I had mine sitting on the lathe just like that. Fell off the back. It cut the power cord of my remote cord. Clean in half.
That would be embarrassing. Especially if it happened during a demonstration. So this one's made out of a round bar, so it's got a lot of mass to it. And the other advantage of having it made out of a round bar, you do have that rounded surface on it. They've also, in this case, it is a nicely made skew. It's got a rounded surface on it. Not all of them come like that. Let me show you some examples. I doubt if there's a Chinese skew made that's made properly like the ones that come out of Sheffield, England. They all have sharp edges along here. No matter what you do, you put that sharp edge on your cast iron and you can eventually get nicks in it. It's inevitable. It's a lot harder to do any kind of rolling on it because and it's harder to slide because you've got that little point that's kind of catching onto every little thing that's on there. Whereas if you get one like this jet that's made in Sheffield, England, you can see it's got this nicely rounded side on the top and the bottom, and the edges are what they call arist. You're not going to cut yourself running your finger along the edge. So it slides much easier, and it's easier to roll a bead with it. And you're not going to find that on the cheap skews, so that's kind of a dead giveaway if it's a cheap skew.
What's the optimum size if you're just going to get one to start out with?
For me, that's a personal choice, but I would say 3/4 inch. Now, I bought a Harbor Freight set because I already had a Harbor Freight set, but I went over to take classes with Jack, and Jack says, "Oh, you got the wrong set. We got to go get you another. You got to buy another set. You got to get the ones with red handles because they're better steel." Well, they both had a 1-inch skew and a 1/2-inch skew. Neither one of these are as thick as that jet, even the 1-inch. The 1/2-inch, what I don't like about it is it's a little flimsier, but when we talk about that planing cut, where we're coming along the edge, and I don't know if I emphasize enough, you're always cutting in the lower half or the lower third. And the reason for that is here's the fulcrum, here's where the tool is being anchored, and it's all about leverage. If you start cutting on this end, it's going to dig in the wood, and you're going to get a skate back. It's going to come slamming down tool rest. You cut on the lower end, and it's being supported right here. Well, if you're cutting in the lower third or the lower half with a skew, which one has got a bigger sweet spot? You know, the larger the better. But then you got that trade-off is how comfortable is this for doing most of the work you do. And if you're doing a lot of balusters, this is great. If you're doing a lot of Christmas tree ornaments and smaller spindle kind of work that I do, this I generally find kind of useless. It's just too big. There's too many times where you could make the cut, except I'm trying to get in here between the tailstock and the wood to do a cut, and I just don't have any maneuver room. But I find that the 3/4 is a real good compromise in size. Now that said, there's times when you start getting in on some small ornaments and smaller spindle work where you find out that the 3/4 is a little too big, and you can get in there with a 1/2 inch, much easier. And you're doing small, delicate cuts. You're not doing, long peeling cuts or planing cuts. You're working on small V's or putting a little fillet or something like that, in which case a 1/2 inch is fine. So I said there's three basically kinds of skews. You got that oval skew, you got the rectangular skew, small, medium, and large. You also have round skews, like this one. They tend to be fairly small. I don't think I've seen one bigger than a 1/2 inch, and I'm not sure I've seen one of those. I've just read about them because the bigger they get, they're just less functional to use. But this is a great little skew for small detail things on finials because number one, because it's round, you don't get any of that catching. And because you're doing small detail, delicate work, you don't need a real big edge. You need a sharp point on either the toe or the heel to get in there and do some detail. And this is a homemade one out of a piece of high-speed steel bar from Inco. It costs about $3.50.
So do you always have an angle, like you always have a toe and a heel, it's never straight across?
Yeah, is it skewed?
Okay.
Because basically, you know, it could be like this, and there may be purposes for having a tool like that. Generally, the advantage of having the skew is it gives you a little bit more convenient angle the way you position it on your body, whereas to get that same curve, you'd have to bring the handle all the way around like this, and then you've got extended over your fulcrum, so you know it's going to be a little more catch prone. But here's an example of one, the beading and parting tool. Well, you know, it's two edges, it's a chisel, so it's got a lot of the characteristics of a skew. It just doesn't have a skewed edge to it. We had a guy that taught a class out here, Al Simmons, Hal Simmons, and he described the reason he had a skew is because it cut through the wood better, and he says, you know, the French discovered this back when they invented the guillotine, so it had a 45-degree angle, so when it came down, it sliced the wood. Whereas the British were using a broad axe, and when it came down, it was coming down like this, straight down, and if it wasn't real sharp and the guy wasn't very skilled, sometimes it didn't sever the head, and that's why you paid the guy a couple of gold coins when you went up there to have your head taken off, so he would get a clean cut.
It's a negative rate scraper too.
We'll get to that when we get the specialty cuts out. You're getting ahead of me. You know, Dave Ellsworth in his book said there's no such thing as a bad tool. There's just tools we use less often. So the other cut is the facing cut. Well, there's different, you know, what I found is very few people like me, and that's a good thing. I'm kind of single-threaded. When Jack got me turned on to wood turning, it's like, yep, my planer's not going to get a lot of work that I just bought. My joiner's not going to get a lot of work. My table saw's not going to get a lot of work. And I got to find me a lathe, and the rest of it is history. There's no, you know, we're all different. I won't say that's wrong. It's just different. Me, one of the fun things about it is that I'm doing something that not everybody else can do, and I'm willing, and I find that enjoyment, like you're talking about, John, just going down in your basement and making shavings, and taking that 2x4, and I found it a lot of fun to turn that 2x4 into toothpicks as I developed the skill. Now this is a facing cut. Now we're going to come in almost at it, 90 degrees, but then we're going to cock it over about 3 degrees. Now I'm not measuring it. I couldn't tell you whether it's 1 degree or 5 degree, but I'm definitely cocking it to the right just a little bit. So I'm only cutting again with the tip. End grain is very hard. This is a big piece of wood, bigger than I would normally face off with a skew.
You're cutting with the toe?
Say again?
Are you cutting with the toe?
I'm cutting with a toe or the long point. Exactly. Because if you do it this way, it's harder to see that edge. This way you can see that edge. Either one would work, but you've got a little more control, a little more confidence if you can see that point. Now, you can get a really smooth cut with a skew. The important thing, I think, the point I want to make out of here, though, you can see how many times I had to cut it because it was a little irregular cut on the tables, on the bandsaw or the chainsaw, and I could only take off no more than a 32nd of an inch. And I was probably off, I don't know, I didn't measure it, but probably at least 3/32 an inch, more than 1/8 of an inch from the high end to the low end. So that was a lot of multiple cuts. Well, guess what? A better tool for that is using a bowl gouge. because a bowl gouge will cut will cut a much bigger cut, but it also cuts in two ways. It's cutting, it's slicing with part of the edge, and another part of the edge is peeling. So it's doing two different things simultaneously. And it cuts more, and it will give you just as good a cut, if not better. You can see those shavings, but look how much more I can cut off. So what's so special about doing a facing cut with a skew? Because you can. But the other thing is, if you have a few tools, if you learn to use them and get as much out of them as you can, if you're doing something small, say something smaller than this, and you can face, and you have a skew in your hand, well heck, face it off, especially if it's cut nice and smooth, because it'll only take one or two cuts. And that's a heck of a lot faster than putting it down and going grabbing a bowl gouge. So use the tool that's fastest to get the job done in an appropriate and safer manner.
It's going to save you money.
All right, let's talk a little bit about some specialty cuts. Let's say this is going to be a box. Well, one of the things, we're not made in a box because it's got a bad crack in it, but that's not going to interfere with us. But one of the things you typically do when you're doing a box is you're going to cut off, you're going to drill a hole in the center, because that's the fastest and easiest way, at least in my experience, but not everybody agrees with me, to do a depth hole and also get rid of that area in the middle that's just barely moving. So one of the specialty cuts, and I use a skew almost exclusively for this, is if I want to just chamfer that center a little bit, like that, just to get a starter hole for the drill. So it doesn't wander. And you can do this with other tools. You can do it with a detail gouge. I just find this one easier, and because I use a skew a fair amount, it's generally pretty close at hand, and I think it does a better job for that. Now, let's talk about hand position a little bit. There's two basic positions for using a skew. There's the underhanded grip, and then there's an overhanded grip. Sometimes it's just pressed down, sometimes it's grabbed. There's no right or wrong, it's whichever one is most comfortable for you, and in some instances one is going to be superior to the other. If you're doing some V-cuts on some small stuff, a tied underhand where you get your finger underneath the tool rest and support it with your thumb is one cut. If you're doing a beading cut, it helps if you have your hand guiding along the tool rest, but you can do that with either an underhanded or an overhand, using the heel of your hand or using the back of your fingers. Now let's talk about that, going back to Carol's question about that angle. Let's just show you in slow motion. So here's the thing flat, it's rubbing the bevel. We slowly pick it up, and we're slicing because we've got it at almost a 45-degree edge, and you can just see how, now if we turn it wide, we're going to plane more wood, and then we're going to get into that very aggressive cut where it's actually ripping up fibers. And if you do a small piece in a small chuck, like you're doing I'll show you in a little while, an angel ornament, you'll jerk it out of the chuck if you're not careful trying to do a peeling cut on the end where you got some leverage out here on the wood. It'll just jerk it right out of your chuck. But when you got it turned at that angle, you just get that, and the more you turn it, the smaller the shaving's going to be, and you're just going to get a really nice finish. What have I missed, Michael?
When you was talking about the angles, you can have a rounded angle as well as a straight skewed angle.
Yeah, I was going to talk about the sharpening, but we can talk about that now, and then we'll follow up with it, sharpening. Most of this one has got a slightly rounded edge. This one is a better example. And this is pretty much the way it comes from Alan Lacer.